much. Thank you.
Shukriya, please. Thank you to all of you who've come today on what is a very important death anniversary for both Pakistan and the world. Thank you especially to Lord Owen. You provide a vital link between then and now. Thank you also to George Galloway, a friend of democracy and a friend of Pakistan for many years. And thank you also to Professor Ian Talbot, a historian and scholar who's made studying Pakistan part of his life's work. We are here today to commemorate the life of a man who was the first democratically elected Prime Minister of Pakistan, Shaheed Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, an international leader on the world stage. He was also my grandfather. When I try and think of my first recollections of his existence, I realize that I can't. I never had the privilege of meeting him. I never experienced the joy of being held by him or holding his hand. But I've grown up with his constant presence around me. I knew the story of his life without ever having been told it. And I'd had the honor of studying at Christ Church, Oxford, where he also studied. That period of his history, which he said gave him his Western mind while still retaining his Eastern soul. Like my mother, his life was cut cruelly short. At the age of 51, after lengthy and biased court proceedings, he was judicially murdered on 4th April 1979, 36 years ago today. But I don't just want to look back. I also want to look forward, to focus on some of the things that I've learned about him, which I believe are as relevant today in Pakistan as they were then. His vision, his dream to make Pakistan a better place, not just for the wealthy few, but for the millions, not just for the men, but for the women, not just for the Muslims, but also for religious minorities. To appreciate his life, we also have to cast our minds back to what Pakistan was like in the 1970s. Pakistan was still a young country, independent for barely 20 years. It had just lost its eastern wing, which had become the independent country of Bangladesh. It had just fought and lost a war with India. But instead of allowing Pakistanis to give up hope, my grandfather revitalized the country. He negotiated a peace with India, brought back 90,000 prisoners of war, and regained 5,000 square miles of territory which had been lost. He restored a faltering country's pride and set Pakistan on the path to democracy. Where all had previously failed, he created the consensus to unanimously pass the 1973 Constitution. In a country where different linguistic and ethnic origins, this achievement cannot be underestimated. It remains the bedrock of our constitutional stability. He took politics out of the drawing room to the man on the streets, in the villages, cities, across the country. That was the message of the foundation of the Pakistan People's Party in 1967. Under his leadership, he formed the Pakistan People's Party into a truly national party, so that the common man and woman really did feel like they had a stake in their country. Years later, I heard how a political opponent of my grandfather had wept at his death. When asked why he was weeping when he was not even a supporter of the Pakistan People's Party, his answer was, "No, I'm not a supporter of the Pakistan People's Party. But it was Zulfikar Ali Bhutto who gave me the right to vote. Without him, I would never have been able to vote against him." Standing here in Britain, where many take one man, one vote for granted, you cannot underestimate this achievement. Yes, the system may still be flawed, but we have a system to build on, and that is what is important. And that is the legacy of Shaheed Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. His name remains synonymous with a host of international and domestic accomplishments, from the historic agreements of Simla and Tashkent to his diplomatic rapprochement with China and the Islamic Summit of 1974, held in Lahore. He was a genius on the international stage, a most consummate diplomat who stood tall at the United Nations, the OIC, and the non-aligned movement. Judging by his record, one cannot but feel that he was one of the most brilliant statesmen of his generation. His passionate belief in an Islamic renaissance had nothing to do with the religious fascism we see today. As early as 1948, as a young student, he presented a paper on Islamic heritage in which he wrote, and I quote, "Many Westerners believe that Islam was a danger to Christianity, but this notion is unfounded. At the peak of Islam's strength, the Christians were treated kindly everywhere and given full liberty to worship according to their ways. The Prophet, peace be upon him, had frequently said that the lives, properties, and laws of Christians and Jews were under the protection of God. And he said, if anyone infringes their rights, I myself will be his enemy, and in the presence of God, I will bring a charge against him." The Muslim world today is beset by conflict and strife. Fanaticism, intolerance, and sectarianism are impeding the march of Muslims into the 21st century. If his alternative vision for the Muslim world, if his work towards peace and cooperation had been allowed to continue and had been built upon by progressive individuals, such as my grandfather and my mother, who knows how different the situation in the world might look today. While he governed for only 4.5 years, during his premiership, Pakistan underwent far-reaching reforms. He gave the poor hope with Roti Kapra Aur Makan. He revolutionized his revolutions in healthcare, in education, and with the rights and opportunities he granted to laborers, farmers, industrial workers, and women, gave birth to the Awami era. He believed in a strong Pakistan, not reliant on others, but self-sufficient and non-aligned. His research centers in defense and agriculture and the drives towards mechanization laid the basis for a modern industrial state. From the Karakoram Highway in the north to the development of Bin Qasim Port in the south, he cast his shadow, opening the countries to its neighbors. Tragically, his assassination in 1979 cut short his achievements. Under the rule of General Zia-ul-Haq, the state fell victim to the beginnings of that religious fascism which we see today, when many of the advances made under my grandfather were reversed. During the Zia regime, Pakistan actually had the dubious distinction of being the first country to actually take away rights which had been granted to women. In order to unravel the democratic process, in the erroneous name of Islamization, Zia introduced a system of behavior alien to our culture, our history, our laws, our society, and our lives. For those who lived through it, the images of people being flogged and hanged in public were horrific. He institutionalized repression of all political dissent, the period now universally acknowledged as the darkest decade in our history. It was against the backdrop of General Zia's political repression and societal destruction that my mother began her own political struggle. She took up my grandfather's mantle. Again, her life was cut short by the same religious fanatics spawned by Zia's regime. During her last years, her constant refrain was against the forces of religious extremism, and she realized this well before others, which threatened the peace and stability of not only our country, but the region and the world. Today, as we gather here to remember my grandfather, I also wish to remind you of his vision for Pakistan. In his own words, of a Pakistan whose social standards are comparable to those of parts of Europe. This means a war against illiteracy and ignorance. This means fighting prejudice and obscurantism. This involves equality of men and women. It demands the mobilization of the people's collective energies. It dictates the restoration to the human person, the citizen of Pakistan, of the dignity which is his due. It requires a check on the growth of population and easy access to education and medical care throughout the country. It contemplates better towns and cities and cleaner villages. It poses 100 challenges. It's a long haul, We have braced ourselves for it. Today, in 2015, we'd like to build on that vision of a Pakistan working in cooperation to further the democratic process, so that Pakistan has the opportunity of becoming a peaceful, prosperous, and progressive state. It is incumbent on us to reclaim the ideological ground and cultural space ceded to extremists, where religion provides spiritual solace and does not serve as a basis for violence or division. Pakistan's original identity is as a people of South Asia, the descendants of the noble Indus Valley civilization and the followers of a Sufi tradition, who were tolerant of religious diversity and imbued with a love for humanity. To create a Pakistan which is pluralistic society, united yet diverse, where people can live, travel, work freely with dignity and respect, we need to confront the challenges, the polarization, the terrorism, the growing population, the energy and water shortages, and the economic hardships faced by millions. When General Zia ul-Haq tried not only to bury my grandfather's body, but also every living memory of him, I have been fortunate enough to have found my grandfather in the loving embrace of the poor, the disenfranchised, and the less fortunate. Even though General Zia tried to silence him, I hear his voice echo from the majestic Himalayas to the delta of the mighty Indus. I hear his voice in the cries of the mother who has to bury her child, brutally murdered by the Taliban. I hear Shaheed Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's voice in every anguished cry of the persecuted, and I see him in every Pakistani that still wants Pakistan to be a pluralistic, democratic, and modern state. The face of Pakistan is not General Zia ul-Haq or Osama bin Laden. Pakistan is not the most dangerous country on earth. It is the most courageous. For the face of Pakistan is Shaheed Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and all the innocent victims of terrorism. My mother, Shaheed Mohtamma Benazir Bhutto, the first female prime minister of the Muslim world who sacrificed her life fighting for democracy and the peaceful message of Islam. Shaheed Salman Taseer, who spoke in defense of the persecuted by minorities. Pakistan's first Christian federal minister, Shaheed Shehbaz Bhatti. The more than 150 school children massacred in Peshawar. The heroic schoolboy Etizaz Hassan, who embraced a suicide bomber to save the lives of his classmates. Our courageous Nobel Peace Prize winner, Malala Yousafzai, who did not let a bullet to the head silence her campaign for education equality. It is the vast majority of us who are prepared to die fighting these religious fanatics rather than bow before them, who are the true faces of Pakistan. ZA Bhutto, ZA Pakistan.
Thank you very much, Bilawal Bhutto Zardari, for concluding this legacy seminar of Shaheed Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Before I close the proceedings for tea, excuse me, thank you, thank you. Thank you very much. Amanullah, you can present it at the tea. Will you present it at the tea? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Amanullah. You'll have the opportunity during the tea, before I close proceedings for tea. Thank you. I would just like to say that the event has been put together by a number of people behind the scenes, and so I want to thank Ambassador Wajid Shamsul Hassan and also Dr. Asim very much indeed for all their help. As well as Asad Zulfikar for preparing the film that we saw, and all the other supporters and friends, including the hotel staff, for all the arrangements. I'd just like to say now that the cameras should close off because the tea is off the record, but you are welcome to come for the tea, and the guests will be mingling, and so there will be an opportunity for you all to talk to them. Thank you once again all very much for coming. Thank you.
Well done. Well done.